And we're at the top of the hour. There's so far just the five of us here, but I think this should not stop us from getting started because we'll go through a bit of agenda in the first minute anyway. So you all know the note well, which applies to this interim meeting. You all know how this goes, so let's start with the agenda in the notes. We have one big topic for today that is everything around CDE and default serializations. We have two presentations filed for today, one from Lawrence and one from Carsten. And if nobody objects, I'll take those in the sequence in which they were filed. Is there anything else to discuss today? Hearing nothing, I suggest we get started. I'll switch over to Lawrence's slides and hand slide control over. Lawrence, please take it away.
Okay. You can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So mostly just was, I don't have a particular point to make. I wanted to just get some understanding from the working group about what it means when something like COSE or CWT doesn't specify a serialization. So kind of, is there a default? Is that the default? What does that mean? Most CBOR-based protocols don't specify serialization, right? So CWT, COSE, and SNML are examples that they don't say what serialization to use. I mean, there's an exception for the SIG structure in COSE, which absolutely requires deterministic, but by and large, it's doesn't say anything. So I think there's possibly a couple interpretations of this. I don't have a strong opinion about this. I mean, we last meeting we had a little discussion on this. So the first interpretation is that an interoperable decoder of these protocols must implement all serialization options, including indefinite lengths. So basically, the all serializations are on the table. That's that's what the document says. It doesn't say there's any narrowing of the serialization to preferred or anything like that. So the documents basically say that, and if a true rigorous implementation would implement particularly decoding of indefinite lengths. An interpretation that I've taken in some of the discussion is that the specifications are incomplete and need to be profiled. So you don't know what serialization is in play. And they're intentionally unspecified to be flexible. So you could have them implemented if you're implementing them in a constrained environment, then that wants streaming, then you can do them with streaming. If not, you use the definite lengths. I think the other thing I've heard said is that this is covered by generic decoders. So generic decoders, or maybe it's generic encoders in this case, cover this. The thing I would also observe is that I suspect most implementations of like CWT, COSE, SNML, and the like do not decode indefinite lengths. And because decoding of indefinite lengths is difficult. So that kind of goes at odds with interpretation one in a way. So that's the framing, and like last week, last meeting, we kind of landed on interpretation one, and with the point that, yeah, most implementations don't actually do indefinite lengths, but it's okay because that's what most just kind of works out that way interoperably. So then the other, I think I had one more slide here. So this, I'm afraid, is a little bit of a can of worms in some ways, but I think the question needed to be asked, is there a default serialization? That applies when something doesn't specify a particular serialization. Is the default all serialization, including I should have written indefinite lengths there, is what I meant to say. Some of the other discussions, about default serializations is that some folks have proposed that preferred or even CBOR be the default serialization. So that's all I had to say. So I'll just have some discussion now.
As Carsten, I think you want to answer a bit of a later point. I'd like to start at page, I think it was 2, a bit earlier. I don't quite understand what's the difference between interpretation 1 and 3. I mean, both wind up saying it's okay to use like anything that is valid, well-formed CBOR, but it's just a matter of how people use it.
I would answer that in that a generic decoder is not, there's no normative definition of a generic decoder. That is just a sort of a concept and an idea. So if you're looking for true, nobody, COSE, CWT do not require you to use a generic decoder. It's just a concept that's convenient and described in the document. It's not a normative thing. So if you're looking for a true normative definition of an interoperable protocol, it can't involve generic decoders the way they're defined right now.
Okay, I think that clarifies it to the point where I can understand that. Thanks. Carsten, you're in the queue.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a few slides that provide a little bit more detail here, but I think it's already possible to answer the questions on this in the next slide, because well, if you use CBOR, you are using CBOR. So there is nothing in CBOR that would enable you to define subsets automatically for a certain application protocol or something like that. So yes, interpretation 1 is correct, except that in reality we get a little bit easement from that, and I come to that on slide 13 or so of my slide. So I really need to dive a little bit into doing this. Interpretation 2 is definitely wrong, and interpretation 3 is just another way to say interpretation 1, but it's a little bit more on the side of looking at interoperability and what actually happens, as opposed to legal reading of the specification and trying to derive some compliance sentence from that. And the answer for the next slide is actually there is no such thing as a default serialization. So there is no question that I can derive from this slide. there may be serialization constraints, but except for CDE, there is no document right now that would say, here's your CBOR data model level information, and here is the serialization for that. That's not something we have had in CBOR so far.
Right.
So the question really seems to be, is there a default constraint set? And I would say yes, the default constraint set is the empty constraint set, because there is nothing that has been said that would put constraints in here. So if you can go to page 3, maybe people understand the answer I'm giving. I think I'm done.
Yeah. So I absolutely, I'm going to just a couple of quick comments, and then I can go to Joe. I mean, I realize that there's no document that defines a default serialization. It's just been talked about a little bit, but going back to here on interpretation 1, I actually ask you to comment a bit on the fact that most decoders in decoding of protocols like CWT and SendML do not implement indefinite lengths. I mean, what do you think of that? I mean, is that good or bad or neutral or something we can live with and unfortunate? Should they really? Is it a should they do this, or must they implement indefinite lengths?
As that's a direct question, maybe Carsten, you can answer directly, and we take Joe's question next.
So the way things are written up at the moment, the answer is yes. If you want to have a complete COSI implementation, then you implement indefinite length. And it's not like this is really hard. I mean, it's hard. I come to that on my slides. But this is essentially the only question we left open when we finished 7049. So 7049 started with not having indefinite lengths, and it was a nice and wonderful standard. And then people came on and said, oh, we need some way to support streaming. And of course, the answer is indefinite lengths, but that did increase the complexity of the protocol. So that's maybe unfinished business that we really should be getting to at this point. But right now, the situation we have is that a COSI implementation or any implementation can receive CBOR can get into the situation where somebody would send indefinite length information, and indefinite length maps and arrays are trivial. So I would really wonder why people are not doing them, ignoring Christian's comment about stack size at the moment. While indefinite length strings are really more work, and they motivate me to say we have unfinished business here. So yeah, that is an unfortunate situation and something maybe we should do something about.
Okay, thank you. Understood.
So I think that there is a little bit of discussion to be had. I think it's implied in 8049 that you should be sending valid CBOR, and I think only should, but I think it's without anybody. If you don't say anything about serialization, you probably are signed up to support all well-formed, modulo the two choices that are given in in the CBOR draft or the CBOR standard. The choices are either replace invalid with some sort of replacement value, or error. And that's like, which of those you choose means that like there's this, it may be that valid might be the right thing for the default serialization, because a good implementation of the CBOR standard can just error if it receives either invalid UTF-8 or duplicate map keys. Well, I mean, so Carson says valid isn't relevant to serialization, but that's the only way that you get invalid is poor serialization, I think. I mean, invalid UTF-8. I don't know.
That sounds like an additional kind of worms one might open. Is that one that you want to open or that you think has been opened already?
What? I mean, all right. Say I send an unpaired surrogate encoded as what otherwise would have been UTF-8. It's not valid UTF-8, but it's syntactically processable, right? Some implementations will turn that into an unpaired surrogate because they're incorrect. Some implementations will turn that into the replacement character, FFFD, whatever that one is. And then some implementations will error. Is that interoperable? And clearly the first case is wrong, so fine. But I could choose to either error or put a replacement character in.
That sounds to me not so much like an interoperability concern, but more like a correctness concern, in that someone already sent wrong data and it's just a matter of whether the other picks it up. So to repeat the question of is that a question that you think is already on the table in the context of the whole CDE or the whole default serialization discussion? Or is that something you would like to bring in as a new concern to check while we're at it?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm thinking about it. So let me step off let somebody else talk for a while I think.
I think then it's Carsten in the queue again.
Yeah, that's definitely another can of worms. And we had a lot of discussion about this. And when finally someone came up with a distinction between well-formed and valid, there was a big sigh of relief. Because really the point of separating well-formed from valid is that we don't want to put an onus on every decoder to do certain kinds of checking. And that, of course, means that this whole field of how do I actually handle invalid CBOR is kind of in a dark corner, because the whole point was to avoid implementations, giving implementations a single the right thing they need to be doing there. But I think validity is not really relevant to serialization. So what is it? If I put an array in the CWT slot of a COSI structure instead of a map, that's approximately the same thing as not sending valid data. So yeah, no. Again, the whole point was not putting an onus, and there should is a must with certain well understood exceptions, and we are not in that territory, but we are in the territory of highly desirable behavior. And if you look at IJSON is a really interesting document. because they were in a similar quandary, and they decided to describe all their interoperability requirements not in terms of must, but in terms of saying, oh, by the way, if you don't do that, it will not be interoperable. So this is a very relaxed form of normative statement that still logically is just the definition of IJSON. So I wouldn't want us to get into that end of the spectrum, but yeah, must, but we know you won't. No, that's really the point. It's not a must. It's very desirable, and it will help interoperability and all that. But the reason that it might not be interoperable is that somebody sent invalid data. So we're kind of on the safe side.
Okay, so I spent some time reading, I think it's 5.6. It clearly says that generic decoders, or some, or maybe no, it clearly says decoders can process maps with duplicate keys. So the label, the word indefinite is, or I mean, the word invalid is used, but it is not categorically excluded. And there's a real use case here. I mean, multi-maps are definitely a thing that you know, some classes and some languages support. They're not common, but it's definitely a thing. So it seems like the question here is, it seems like it's totally okay in CBOR in the broad sense to send maps with duplicate keys. It will be labeled as invalid, and some decoders will say, I can't do that. But it's the text in section, I think it's 5.6, definitely seems to allow this, and it's a valid use case. The other thing is that this seems, yeah, it's not part of serialization, is in that it is not, it's more part of the data model. It's not part of serialization in that, like, you know, what the optimizations that are allowed in CBOR for constrained environments. So I see your text, your point in the chat there, Karsten. But read section 5.6. It clearly implies it's allowed, and nowhere does it say normatively that invalid is not allowed. It doesn't say. It doesn't just. It just labels it as invalid with the implication that that's bad.
Yeah, I'm not sure I should be jumping in the queue here. But yeah, 5.6 is the validity of duplicate keys of maps. Or it is contributing to that discussion. And the point here is that in, can anyone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
This is pretty weird. So there was an error message coming up, and my video is not coming through for some reason. So anyway, the fact that there are decoders that present to the application information that is invalid is something a good representation format should support. That does not mean that the representation format suddenly includes all these cases where decoders can do diagnostics. That wouldn't make sense. So there needs to be two different boundaries for something that you don't want to process, and something that you cannot process because it's not even well formed, and therefore you have no idea how to understand the syntax of that. And that is exactly the difference between well formed and valid. That does not mean that people get license to use invalid CBOR. That's a very that's an excuse that is used. Doris, you are very fixated on RFC 2119 keywords, which is an ailment that several IETFers suffer from. But a document makes its normative statements independent from these keywords. The keywords
I'm
are there to...
not fixated. I'm just trying to work the thing here. Please don't talk down to me like that. I mean, I can say the opposite of you.
Yeah. So let me just point out that words that are in the document mean something, even if they are not preceded or followed by must or should. So yeah, but again, this is all about data model.
But where does it say that normatively that invalid can't be sent? Does it say normatively in that invalid CBOR must not be sent, should not be sent? Does it say that in a normative way somewhere? Whatever words you choose, right? Does it say that other than just labeling it as invalid, does it actually exclude you from sending that? I mean, it looked to me like the intent was that CBOR can support multi-maps if you choose to do it.
No, definitely not. That is a gross misconception.
That's not a gross misconception. It's a careful reading of the words in section 5.3.
Okay. Yeah, I think I have read carefully as well.
Yeah, please don't talk down to me. Read it again, quote it, check it.
I think it's a pretty normal situation that two people that read an English language text come to different conclusions here. But let me explain what the point of doing this was. The point of doing this was to separate well-formedness from validity, so we don't get a checking onus on the decoder. That's the whole point why well-formed and valid are separated. And reinterpreting invalid as something that needs to be processed by receiver is definitely not the intention of this text.
Okay, so I'll go back and reread 5.3 really carefully, but I believe it does mention multi-maps, and some places it says multi-maps are not okay, and some places it doesn't. It's just...
We actually have an old draft that at some point we probably should revive that provides solutions for the multi-map problem. So that has not gone unnoticed. And Joe has the answer in the chat.
Sure, you're allowed to error on receiving invalid, but you're also allowed to not error. I mean, I don't care which way you go. I just want to be clear.
But you cannot ignore it. The point one, in the bullet 1 in 5.3 says you replace the problematic item with an error marker and continue with the next item, which means that there is an error marker there now. And I would expect that an application like COSI that tries to enforce security doesn't work on error markers.
Yeah, that's just an implementation technique. That's not a normative specification. So what matters here is being clear about what you should and should not send. And I think your answer right now is that no encoder should ever send duplicate keys.
That's not true. That's not what I said. And that's why this is so difficult. An encoder may not be in a position to enforce this validity constraint. The streaming encoder doesn't have all keys that go into the map, and often doesn't have the memory to remember all keys that already went into the map. So the encoder may need to rely on some external input to have certain properties that make the thing valid.
Okay.
It's not the onus of the encoder to check this.
So encoders should not send it, but they might, and decoders should be prepared for this.
Yes.
Okay. That's all right.
But it shouldn't process this as valid data if it's invalid.
Okay. And there's no intent to support multi-maps whatsoever.
Not in major type 5. We have tags, so we can use tags to support multi-maps. And there are at least 2 reasonable formats for multi-maps that are described in that internet draft. Maybe somebody can dig that out.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we have at least some common understanding of what the intention is here without everyone being super happy about it. Any added comments on this topic before we move on to Carsten's presentation, which will probably pick up some of those earlier points again?
Yeah, just on Joe's implied should, we have had a strong discussion about what should means, and I don't want to repeat that discussion here, but I think that Joe has a different should in mind than the one that is usually being used.
So just to check, like my own understanding from what we've discussed here, the way I've treated that well-formed invalid and valid distinction was always that if I write a program that receives data from some other component, then I might rely on that other program to like not produce duplicates or to produce valid UTF-8. And I would forward under those assumptions in the hope that things don't break if my provider does not produce, violate its own promises. But I'm not required to make those promises on my own because I usually couldn't. Does that make sense in that context? Or have I been on mute while I was talking?
No, I think what you said was right. And I think it's really important to explain to people who are focused on conformance, and then many people come into the IETF with that point of view, that we are not that interested in conformance, we are interested in interoperability. So if we have ways to create interoperability that do not require to ratchet up the level of conformance at every stage in the processing, that's a net win because we can avoid processing that we don't want to do in constraint or high performance systems. So that's why this word onus, yeah, if you want to interrupt with generic decoders with invalid is definitely 7493 language that we could have been using here. ITF language.
Okay, thank you. Then shall we move on to Carsten's presentation? I'll pass slide controls. If I can.
Okay, I wanted to make a slide that said, I don't understand the question. And it turned out it's now like 20 slides, of which I at least want to get to the first 15. So let me quickly go through these. Some of this has already been said. I'm really looking at this from the perspective of somebody who is interested in finishing this document. But I think that the indefinite length discussion shows that we need to have that discussion. And yeah, I hope somebody takes note of what Joe said in the chat. There are two axioms here that I'm really not interested in violating in any way during this work. One axiom is we do not do technical changes to 8949. Whether some clarifying text is a technical change to you, to reader X, is maybe not the really important question here, but whether this actually causes the RFCs to mean something different than it did before. So I'm fine with Rowan's idea of actually slapping label updates on this document, updates 8949. Even if we don't change the technical content, we do provide better text, and that's also an update. The other thing is that we can define terms. So this is something that some higher entity has given to us as a possibility, and we should use that. But we only should define them when they are useful. So people have been, okay, will do. People have been, you might do it as well.
I said turn on, not turn off.
Turn. Oh, sorry, I don't read that fast. Okay, it's
Like
really useful to see how people are reacting.
Yes.
And by the way, as a receiver, you can press some button to stop the video if that overloads your system. Okay, so the fact that it's so hard to talk about definite length only is maybe something we need to do. And I think Joe has already pointed out that we haven't been using the term well-formed CBOR the way we could have been using it. And these are things that we should really think about. And if you see terms on these slides, on my slides, these are not proposals to introduce them to the document. These are for discussion. And we should vet every new term whether we actually consider it useful. So these are the axiom. And the CDE project was about addressing deterministic encoding. Now, we all know that is defined in terms of preferred serialization as one of the three encoding constraints that go in there, and preferred serialization itself is a set of encoding constraints. Yeah, there's a lot of thinking about preferred serialization as if this is somehow, yeah, something very magic in CBOR. It really started out as a way to tell implementers, by the way, if you do it this way, it's not going to look stupid. Yeah, it has the status of a term. This term is then used in the more normative section of 4.2, but it's not itself a normative requirement. So CBOR nowhere says you have to use preferred serialization for anything except in that section 4.2. And I cannot really see interest in normative use of preferred serialization. And that's why I also think that paragraph 6 in 4.1 can keep its wobbly nature because it's expressing a preference. So it's good to know that preference, but it's not something that influences the normative part of the text in any way. Now, one thing that preferred serialization gives you, it's a source of knowledge about data model equivalence that maybe is something that wasn't separately addressed. It only exists in the form of the specification of preferred serialization. So we have to be very careful what we do here. Joe.
Yeah, if 5, I think it's whatever the thing in 5.3 is that talks about map key equivalents, or is that in 5.6? Wherever it's in section 5 that talks about map key equivalents, if that had been defined in terms of preferred serialization instead of in terms of the data model, it might have been, it's a different implementation path, let's put it that way. Whether it's better or worse, I don't know, but it's...
Are you saying that those two implementation paths lead to different results?
Yes, I am.
Can you put something out to the list, because that would be interesting?
Yeah, I found a case. I'll see if I can find it again.
Okay, so that's really an interesting observation. Okay, in the interest of time, let me just jump forward here. So we have use cases for deterministic encoding, and we have use cases for a common deterministic encoding. So we don't need to discuss that part. Some of those are crypto, some of those are other things like test vectors and diagnostics and so on. So it's pretty clear that what 8949 provided here is finding its use cases, even though it has been mostly ignored for the first 10 years, except for COSI. Now, CDE really technically is an encoding constraint set. So it's a set of encoding constraints that combines 3 encoding constraint sets. The shortest argument constraint set that we call preferred serialization, because the problem with calling it shortest argument is that it's supplemented by per tag additions. So for instance, tag 2, 3 say something about preferred serialization that is not strictly shortest argument. So yeah, it's a set, and the set contains a set, but I think otherwise it's obvious what happens here. We have the definite length only encoding constraint, which is a singleton set. And we have the lexicographic map sorting as a third encoding constraint. So CDE simply is the logical and as a predicate, or the union of the constraints that are listed here. And I'm not saying that we should have DLO and LMS in the document. It's just because it's really hard to make slides without abbreviations like this. So the normative intent of even defining a constraint set is to tell the encoder that it has additional constraints beyond well-formedness. So well-formedness is always in the encoding constraint set, so we don't talk about it. We just say the empty set already includes well-formedness. But the point of doing this, of putting an encoding constraint set out there, is to reduce variation, to reduce onus on the decoder. Now, CDE has other points which are external to what's happening internally in CBOR. So the getting deterministic representation is a good thing, but as the document says, this is not entirely solved on the encoding level. You have to think about the application level itself. Now, I've heard lots of things about onus in the decoder. I have heard indefinite length for strings relatively often, and have had little to say against that. So that was a late addition, and it's an addition that really is costly for people who don't need it. It's not just like, so if you look into Appendix C, 40% of the code in Appendix C is about indefinite length. So it's a sizable part, but that wouldn't even worry me as much, because it's in total like 17 additional lines. That wouldn't worry me as much if it didn't have such a profound effect on memory allocation and API structure. And so it's really something that is more costly than we had in mind in 2013. So this is one thing. We want to have a normative effect on what the encoder can do. And then we also have cases where we actually want a checking decoder. And that's maybe specific to determinism more than to other encoding constraint sets. But other encoding constraint sets might also have that desire to put a normative intent on top of the decoder. So that's why we talk about checking decoders. Yeah, again, the chat is important. I'm not going to react to this, but definitely that's really part of the problem here. Okay, so that's what is going on here. Okay, so one thing that we apparently started to understand in the previous meeting was we don't have a name for the empty encoding constraint set. And I think the result of the last meeting was that we want to use the term well-formed CBOR for that. And I think that's good. And it definitely reduces an attractiveness of inventing other encoding constraints. It's just to have names for them. But the other observation here is we really need a name for definite length only encoding constraint sets, because that's the partial implementation for which we have a big motivation. And I said 40% lines of code in Appendix C, but that is only concerned with well-formedness, not with handling the chunks that fall off the table when you do this. And so it has a really complicated effect on memory allocation. Interesting. Christian found indefinite length arrays. Yeah, good points there. But still, many people see indefinite length as implementation problem. So maybe combining no indefinite length or definite length only with preferred serialization into basic serialization was wrong. We shouldn't have done that. We should just have said we have this single constraint, definite length only, and that gets a name, and you can select that, or you cannot, but it's orthogonal to preferred serialization.
So
Sure.
This was actually how I implemented it, was each one of the different constraints that came up, I made a separate choice on the decoder, whether to error. And then when whatever name we come up with for a bucket of constraints, I'll create a basically a roll-up option to turn on all of the individual constraints that implies. I would be okay with just leaving them as individual constraints and making them selectable by protocol.
Well, I don't know the letter, but selectable in the sense of when I define the protocol, not at one time, I hope.
Oh, absolutely. In the definition of the protocol, if you want anything other than the thing we came up with before, which is well-formed, but if you want to interoperate, send valid, which is, I guess, the default, then if you want anything other than that, you have to specify, here are the constraints.
Thank you. Yeah, one important thing here is the terms we define are terms. They are neither normative nor non-normative, they are terms. So when you look into section 5.2 of RFC 8949, this defines the two terms, generic encoder and generic decoder. So any statement that 8949 doesn't define these terms is incomprehensible to me. Now, these are not normative in the sense of nobody forces you to have a generic encoder or generic decoder to work with CBOR. You can do everything with application-specific implementations. But we have these terms, so we can talk about our implementations, not about what happens on the wire, because the wire doesn't see these things. We can talk about what happens in our implementations in shorter words than I would need to say what a generic encoder and generic decoder is. So that's why I think these are good terms and we should use them, but we should also keep in mind you don't have to have a generic implementation. Okay, what we should not do, that maybe should have been under axioms. We should not misguide application developers into developing profiles. And that's why we struck the term profile from the document. And we should not provide a smorgasbord of options. I just looked into RFC 8949. This doesn't use the word option. And there are a few things that are optional in quotes, but these were all concessions to people who like that word. But we should try to avoid using this. The other thing we should avoid doing is giving the impression of invalidating previous use of RFC 8949. So the thumbprint document, for instance, does use CDE as it is defined today. And we should really make sure that this is the case and that we say so. I have a very quick digression because there's sometimes a bit confusion here that can best be explained by using JSON. So nobody in the JSON world has ever asked whether 7.0 is the same thing as 7.00. Well, maybe somebody who's interested in precision of inexact numbers might ask that, but I think in the mainstream JSON context, that question doesn't exist. And some of the questions that I'm hearing here is, should your JSON encoder be allowed to emit 7.00? Should your JSON decoder be allowed to accept 7.00? And how do I interrupt with one that doesn't? And please keep this example in mind when you're trying to come up with an example, because that's exactly the trap we don't want to fall into. And it even becomes worse because in JSON, there is a definition of numbers that is just saying similar to that used in most programming languages. And if you look at the numbers 42, 42.0, and 42.00, they mean two different things. The three literals mean two different things in most programming languages, except for JavaScript, of course. So that's a pretty weird thing. And most JSON implementations that I'm actually working with make that distinction. So it's really interesting to see that we had to add another document because the data model in JSON simply is not defined. So yeah, 7493 provides pieces of the missing data model. It says interpret all numbers in IEEE 754, binary 64 format. Now, this is deliberately not phrased as a normative statement. It just means, oh, by the way, if you don't do that, you won't be interoperable, which is, yeah, okay. So in summary, where are we? We have had CBOR to use for about 12 years now, and dozens of protocols are using CBOR as their serialization. Well-formed CBOR, not any encoding constraints had, but well-formed CBOR. And there is no actual interoperability problem because, first of all, well-formed CBOR is interoperable without thinking, if you have it. And second, indefinite length encoding is a selectable feature in most encoders. So, for instance, in my encoder, you have to actually fudge the object that creates the string before it falls apart into chunks. And encoders or their users are wise enough to not use it. That's, of course, not something you should write a standard for, but that's where we are. Lawrence.
So from my perspective, where we are is that I've written many comments and things about the CDE document. There's one email that lists, I think, 7 issues. It's called comments on draft CBOR CDE. And where we are is that I feel like none of those comments have been answered. So, and that I think that there's a lot of work to be done on the document in terms of improving clarity and simplicity and readability. that's to me where we are. There's, to a large degree, there's an agreement on the semantics of what we want to do, but like nothing in your presentation really addressed trying to improve the CDE document, and there's been no movement on that. I mean, I've argued many of these things in great detail, and there's basically no response that justifies the document as it is. So that's for me, that's where we're at.
Yeah, so I should have said that I was not going to go into that aspect today, but I wanted to make sure that we get the underlying questions here covered. So I have one more slide that I just wanted to throw into the room so people know it's there. Christian has invented most of what's on this slide, so he might find it familiar. CRIs are a CBOR representation of URIs. And CRIs say if you interchange CRIs as the media type that is defined in this document, which is essentially what this says, you must not use indefinite length encoding. So here we have a serialization constraint offered by a CBOR protocol, by the protocol that says how to represent URI-like information in CBOR. And then, of course, the problem is if you do that, you no longer have composability. You cannot put CRIs into a larger media type that might happen to require some indefinite length encoding at another place. And you will never get an implementation that allows you that kind of fine granular control that would then be needed. So there is some relaxing going on here. Please read this offline. But I think this is the kind of serialization constraint that we will get in other documents as well. And I think Rohan is looking for this kind of for a standard way to make this kind of restriction as well. So if there was a lot of interesting discussion about implementation in the chat that I didn't read, but if we agree that DLO or definite length only is one of our fundamental encoding constraint sets that we want to be able to switch on and off, then that would become easier to say. And I'm done.
Joe?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up another point that I think we've talked about a little bit, and I think there's some kinds of agreement about, but the CBOR draft does a really good job of describing what both encoders and decoders must do in order to support it. And so, for example, if definite length only is one of the constraints, then encoders must not send indefinite length encoding. And decoders, if they're operating in a mode where they are checking at decode time, must error if they receive indefinite. Right. So, but I think that pulling that out into a set of here are the things that a decoder must do when operating in this mode is separate from saying you must be in that mode. So the decoder could always decide to decode without checking anything. But if you are going to check, here's how you check correctly.
Yeah, yes. It may be part of the semantics of a protocol that the decoder has to check because you want to be able to avoid getting the decoder dirty with data that are not under your control. That's why sometimes.
Sorry, go ahead. I interrupted.
No, go ahead.
I think this is an example of Postel was wrong in a good way. Like going ahead and checking that the constraints were met correctly is a Postel was wrong approach that may lead to better interoperability over time.
Yeah, so add a line to the last bullet point here that says really useful for Postel was wrong. What's the RFC number? I've always forget the RFC number.
I don't remember, but yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about whether to cite this RFC at this point and decided I don't have a space on the slide. So that's another really good point.
But I think that's emerging consensus if we get the wording right, where it was not earlier in the discussion. Earlier in the discussion, there were people who were saying, no, let's not put constraints on the decoder.
Well, the document currently has the concept of a checking decoder, so the document would not reflect that. But it's about the application semantics of that determinism. So helping in finding problems is maybe a slightly different requirement here. I think the important thing here to keep in mind, which I didn't put on the slide, is that a CBOR, encoded CBOR data item, does not tell you whether it wants to be just well-formed CBOR or whether it has encoding constraints applied to it. That information, if it is even available, only exists from context. And I think it's really important to retain this property.
I guess we could have a tag that spells out constraints that you put at the root level.
Actually, we have such a tag for CBOR, embedded CBOR and byte strings. Okay, I think we need to finish this meeting.
Oh, indeed, I completely lost track of time.
It was a good discussion.
Yes, I'll have to go through the minute to the chat to see whether there was anything that we didn't pick up on. But I think this is getting somewhere. On the procedural side, Carsten, do you have plans on like how you as an author schedule things between finding the consensus and working things into the CDE document, which Lawrence pointed out?
So I think right now I have answers to all the questions that I need to be able to do editorial work again. And I'm certainly going to dig out Lawrence's email and other emails. And I will generate some pull requests and hope to get some responses from those pull requests, and then at some point submit a -13 with the updates. And I think we should have a couple of iterations through before we have the next meeting, which I think we have in 2 weeks.
Sounds like a good plan. Thank you. Let's do that. Then talk to you on the list and the pull requests, and see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.